A white landlord refuses to rent his property to a black family. But he's shocked when he discovers the truth about his own son's connection to the black family, challenging everything he believed. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. At the window of his fancy office, Mr. Parker looked out at the spotless neighborhood he had helped to build. He felt proud looking at the well-kept lawns and fancy houses. He put a lot of work into making this group private, and he wasn't going to let anyone mess it up. He sighed happily and went back to his desk. He looked at the framed pictures of his homes, which were all proof of how successful he was. Mr. Parker felt the smooth wood with his fingers and thought of the day he bought his first building. He whispered to himself, "I've come a long way." A small smile played across his lips. Mr. Parker had always thought it was important to keep standards high. His rules about renting were strict, and he didn't say sorry for them. He thought that these rules were what kept his properties important and sought after. He took out a stack of rental applications and looked through them carefully. He carefully looked over each form to make sure that only the right people would be able to live in his buildings. He spoke out loud and in a strong voice, "Can't let just anyone in. We have to keep things secret." Mr. Parker stopped and put his hand on one of the applications. He made a face as he read the name. With a quick shake of his head, he threw it in the trash. It was a mumbled, "No, none of them can come here. It would make the whole mood different." He felt a little guilty, but he quickly ignored it. He thought that what he was doing was good for his neighborhood. He told himself that his other renters wouldn't want black people living next door. He thought it was better this way. Mr. Parker leaned back in his plush chair and felt the weight of the choices he had made. He made his heart harder by telling himself that his biases were right. He had built this kingdom all by himself, after all. He was allowed to choose who lived here. He said, "It's my property," as if he were trying to persuade someone who wasn't there. "My rules." The Jameson family was crowded around the kitchen table, and there was a lot of energy. Henry and Cynthia sat next to each other, and their 4 boys Barry, David, and William crammed in close. There were several pieces of paper on the table. They were the rental application for one of Mr. Parker's homes. The first thing Henry said was, "Boys, this could be a big step for our family. We can all grow bigger in the new house." Cynthia said yes, and her eyes lit up with hope. "And it's nearer to your schools. Just think about not having to get up so early every day." The boys looked at each other with interest. 8-year-old Barry asked, "Dad, will we each get our own room?" Henry laughed and messed up Barry's hair. "Son, not quite, but you'll have more room than you do now." Henry started to fill out the application, and Cynthia looked at Barry, David, and William, the 3 younger boys. "How do you feel about the new house?" Barry, his eyes wide with joy, exclaimed, "I hope it has a big backyard." David gave an excited nod. "Maybe we can get a dog after all." Cynthia laughed and said, "One step at a time." Her heart was full of love for her family. William, who was the baby, climbed up on his mom's lap. "Will we still be close to Grandma and Grandpa?" Cynthia gave him a tight hug. "Sweetheart, we'll be a little farther away, but we'll still see them a lot." Before Henry turned in the application, he looked up at his family. Even though they were successful in business, they had always chosen to live a simple life. This move, even though it was small for them, was a step toward a better life for their boys. "Remember," Henry said, in a soft but strong voice, "this house isn't a given. Our application needs to be approved by Mr. Parker." Cynthia put her hand out and squeezed his. "Everywhere we've lived, we've been good renters. That's something Mr. Parker will definitely see." Their hopes were high, and their hearts were full of dreams for their possible new home. The problems they were about to face were unknown to them, but their love for each other and faith in goodness made them ready for anything. Mr. Parker was sitting at his shiny wood desk with a stack of rental applications in front of him. A big gold ring on his finger made him tap impatiently. on the wood while he looked through the papers. He raised an eyebrow when he saw the Jameson family's application. His attention was quickly drawn to the facts. Henry and Cynthia Jameson had 4 boys, a good enough income, and perfect credit. It looked like they would be great renters. When Mr. Parker saw the family picture on the application, he pursed his lips into a thin line. He said to himself, well, in a low, critical voice. What do we have here? He leaned back in his leather chair, and lines appeared on his face from stress. The Jamesons lived in his rental and met all of his requirements. They were successful, had a healthy family, and everyone who knew them gave them great references. But Mr. Parker couldn't ignore one thing: the color of their skin. Somewhere in the back of Mr. Parker's mind told him that he was being unfair, and that turning them down because of their race was wrong. But he pushed that thought away and focused on keeping what he called the character of his properties. It's about standards, he told himself out loud, to help himself believe it. It's not about me. The man gave a heavy sigh, picked up his pen, and started writing on the form that said no. He gave hazy reasons, like worrying that they would be too crowded with 4 kids and too noisy. He knew these were just excuses, though. He felt a twinge of guilt as he sealed the refusal letter in an envelope. He tried to get over it by thinking about how successful he was and how he had made a small, high-class community. Still, the picture of the happy Jameson family stayed in his thoughts. It's just business, he said under his breath, as he put the letter in his mail tray. But even as he said it, Mr. Parker couldn't quite look himself in the office window mirror. Henry Jameson looked at the message from Mr. Parker with slouched shoulders as he sat at the kitchen table. He held the paper with a little shaking, and his face showed a mix of sadness and anger. Cynthia put her soft hand on his shoulder. "Honey, what's wrong? What is it?" she asked, in a soft, worried voice. Henry looked up at his wife, and his eyes were filled with both sadness and resolution. "Mr. Parker turned down our application," he said, in a voice that was almost whispered. "But what do you know? We don't need his fancy home. We're going to build our own house." Cynthia's eyes got bigger. "Let's build our own house? Are you sure?" He said, "Yes," and a small smile appeared on his face. "Yes, I am. We are going to find a piece of land outside of town. It might not be as fancy as Mr. Parker's homes, but it's ours." Cynthia gave him a shoulder squeeze and looked proud. She said, "That's my Henry. He always finds a way forward." Henry got up and gave Cynthia a tight hug. He spoke into her hair. "It won't be easy, but we'll make it work. We always do it." Cynthia took a step back and looked into Henry's eyes. "Remember what we tell the boys all the time: make lemonade when life gives you lemons." Henry was done, and his smile got bigger. "Yes, honey, we must not let this bring us down." Their 4 boys, Barry, David, and William, walked into the kitchen as if on cue, looking around with interested looks. "Dad, what's wrong?" Barry, who is the oldest, asked. Henry felt full of love and pride as he looked at his boys. He spoke with a clear, loud voice. "Boys, we're going to build our own house. It won't be big or fancy, but it will be ours, and we'll fill it with love." The boys' eyes got really bright with joy. "Dad, can we help?" "I'm excited," Barry asked. Henry laughed and said, "Of course. Our family will do it together." Cynthia was happy and hopeful as she watched her husband and kids. She knew that the road ahead would be hard, but she also knew that they could get through it. Charles Parker was jumping for joy as he walked into the shiny showroom of Elite Motors. He was excited to start his new job at the high-end car company. The next day, under the bright lights, the shiny cars shone, and their smooth lines made them look powerful and important. Charles felt proud as he walked up to the front desk. He got the job because of his own skills, not because of his father's TIs. He was happy to be able to stand up straight. A friendly voice told him, "Good morning. Your name must be Charles." My name is Stella, and I'm the HR boss. Hey, and welcome to Elite Motors. Charles gave a warm smile. Thank you, Stella. I'm thrilled to be here. Stella showed Charles around the building and met his new co-workers. Charles felt something different about this workplace as they walked. The air was warmer than he had felt before, not what you'd expect from a nice car company. Stella led him to a modern open-plan office and said, "This is where you'll be working. Mr. Jameson, our CEO, believes in creating a place where people can work together." Charles raised an eyebrow in surprise. The CEO cares about the place where people work? Stella gave a nod, and her eyes sparkled. Oh, yes. Mr. Jameson does a lot of things himself. He and Mrs. Jameson, his wife, built this business on strong morals. They think that everyone, from the cleaner to the CEO, should be treated with respect and honor. Charles was getting more and more amazed as the day went on. He saw workers from different departments work together without any problems. They treated each other with respect and were friendly with each other. During his lunch break, Charles heard two co-workers talking about a new project at work. Is it true that the Jamesons are paying for a community center with some of the money they made? One of them said. That's how they are. Always thinking of ways to give back, the other person responded with warmth. Charles felt a rush of respect. This was nothing like the rough business world his dad had always told him about. In this case, success meant more than just making money. It meant making a difference. Success is not just what you accomplish in your life. It's what you inspire others to do, said a framed quote on the wall. Charles saw it as he walked back to his desk. Charles gave himself a smile. He thought he would really enjoy working here. During the next few weeks, Charles got used to his new job at Elite Motors. He liked the company's ideals and how nice it was to work there. But what stood out to him most was how nice and easy to talk to the owners, Henry and Cynthia Jameson. Charles was going over some papers one afternoon when Henry came by his desk. "How are things going, Charles?" he asked with a smile. Charles was happily surprised when he looked up. "Mr. Jameson, this is going really well. The work here is really fun for me." Henry laughed. "Please call me Henry. I'm glad to hear that you're getting used to things. Cynthia and I were wondering if you'd like to come to our house this Friday for dinner. We like getting to know our workers better." Charles felt very happy and excited. "It would be an honor, Henry. Thank you for the invite." Charles drove to the address Henry had given him on Friday night. He was a little lost as he turned onto a simple street on the edge of town. The owners of a business that does so well would surely live in a nicer area. He became more confused as he pulled up to a simple house that looked cozy. It was well taken care of, but not at all like the house he had imagined. Charles checked the address again and then slowly walked up to the front door. Cynthia Jameson smiled when he knocked and let him in. "Charles, we're so glad you could make it. Welcome inside." In the moment Charles walked inside, he felt right at home. The house was small, but fun and love were all around. In another room, he could hear kids playing. Henry came out of the kitchen and wiped his hands on an apron. "Hi Charles, I hope you're hungry. There's a great pot roast in the oven." Cynthia's soft laugh must have shown that Charles was shocked because of his face. She said in a soft voice, "I know it's not what you were hoping for, but we believe in living simply and focusing on what really matters." Charles became more and more enchanted by the Jamesons' kindness and sincerity as the night went on. They told each other stories about their 4 boys, how they run their business, and how they want to help others. It was clear that Charles and the Jameson family loved each other as he sat down to dinner with them. The air was filled with the smell of Henry's pot roast and the sound of happy chatter and laughing. Henry looked at his wife and said, "Cynthia, call the boys." It was Cynthia who said, "Guys, dinner's ready." There was a rush of 4 excited little boys into the dining room. Charles liked how quickly they got comfortable and set down their chairs without any trouble. Henry was proud and said, Charles, let me introduce you to our sons. This is our oldest son, Barry. Next are Barry, David, and William. Charles was met by all of the boys, who shook his hand and looked him in the eye. Charles couldn't help but smile at how polite they were. Charles paid close attention to what his family was saying while they ate. He was impressed by how smart and driven the boys were. The oldest, Barry, talked about his wish to become a doctor. He said with sincerity, "I want to help people in our community who can't afford health care." Barry added, "I'm going to be an engineer and make buildings that are good for the environment." David, who was the quietest of the four, talked about how much he loved writing. He said in a soft voice, "I want to tell stories that bring people together." William was very young, but he had big hopes. He smiled at Cynthia and said, "I'm going to be a teacher like Mom used to be." Charles was moved by the boys' goals and the joy that Henry and Cynthia showed on their faces. He saw how the parents supported and encouraged each child's dreams by saying kind things. During the meal, Charles watched how the family talked to each other. Even though they lived in a simple place, he found their relationships to be very deep and moving. The boys helped clear the table without being asked, and the talk went smoothly because everyone respected each other and was interested in their lives. Charles felt like he was at home more and more as the night went on. The Jamesons' kindness and modesty were very different from the world he had grown up in, which made it new and exciting to him. Charles went to his parents' fancy house the next night for dinner with them. Even though the dining room had crystal lights and fine china, Charles couldn't help but think of how warm and welcoming the Jamesons' simple home was. "So, Charles, how's that new job going?" Mr. Parker asked as they started to eat. Charles's face lit up. "That's great, Dad. The business is great, and the owners are even better." Mrs. Parker gave a smile. "That's nice, sweetheart. We want to know more about these people." Charles started with a loud, excited voice. "Well, their names are Henry and Cynthia Jameson. They made this business from scratch and treat everyone like family. I went to their house for dinner last night, and it opened my eyes so much." Mr. Parker stood still, with his fork almost in his mouth. He put it down slowly, and a worried look crossed his face. Charles kept talking, not noticing how his father was reacting. "They have 4 sons, and all of them are very polite and driven. It's crazy, but the oldest wants to be a doctor. Their house isn't very big or fancy, but it's filled with love and warmth." His face turned pale. Getting rid of his throat made him nervous. "Jameson, did you say? Where do they live?" Charles answered, "On the edge of town. When they couldn't find a place to rent in the area, they built their own home." "Not bad, isn't it?" It was now clear that Mr. Parker was uncomfortable. He moved around in his seat to avoid looking at his son. While Mr. Parker was acting strangely, Mrs. Parker asked, "Dear, are you all right? You look like you've seen a ghost." Mr. Parker took a deep breath. "Charles," he asked in a rough voice, "is this Jameson family black?" Charles rubbed his forehead in confusion. "Yes, they are. Why does that matter?" Mr. Parker was hit with the idea all at once. The family that his son was admiring so highly was the same one that he had turned down as renters. He felt bad about himself as he thought about the weak reasons he had given to turn them away. Charles kept telling Mr. Parker stories about the Jameson family, and he found himself listening with more and more interest. Even though it made him feel bad at first, he couldn't help but be interested in what Charles said about love and success. "Tell me more about Henry," Mr. Parker asked in a lower voice. "What kind of businessman is he?" Charles's eyes got bright. "He's incredible, Dad. Henry started the company with just a small loan and a big dream. Now, he employs over 100 people and treats them all like family." Mr. Parker slowly nodded, and his face showed that he was thinking. "And the boys said they're ambitious?" "Of course," Charles answered with excitement. "Barry, the oldest, is already taking advanced classes to prepare for medical school. Barry wants to be an engineer, and the younger two are excelling in school too. Mr. Parker felt a twinge of guilt in his chest as Charles talked. He didn't even give the Jamesons a chance before he fired them because of the color of their skin. Listening to what they had done and how they were as people made him question his decision. When Mrs. Parker saw that her husband was thinking, she asked him in a soft voice, "What are you thinking, dear?" Mr. Parker let out a heavy sigh. "I'm not sure if I made a big mistake," he said, in a voice that was barely above a whisper. Charles looked at his dad with the confused look on his face. "What do you mean, Dad?" Mr. Parker thought about what to say for a moment before starting. "The Jamesons applied to rent one of our properties a while back. Two turned them down." Charles was shocked, and his eyes got really big. "But why? They're such wonderful people." It made Mr. Parker feel bad when he understood how bad what he had done was. He let his biases get in the way of his good judgment, which could have cost his community a wonderful family. The quiet Mr. Parker said to himself, more than to his family, "I think I need to think about some things again." He looked up at Charles with eyes that were both sad and interested. "Tell me more about them, son. I want to understand." As the days went by, Henry Jameson and Charles Parker became better friends at work. Their friendship grew naturally because they respected each other and shared the same beliefs. Henry and Charles sat in the small yard area at work during their lunch break one sunny afternoon. Although it was warm, the leaves of an oak tree close moved in the wind as they ate their sandwiches. "You know, Charles," Henry began, his eyes warm with joy, "I've been meaning to tell you how much I value our friendship. It's not often that you meet someone who really gets how important hard work and kindness are." Charles smiled because Henry's words made him feel good. "I feel the same way, Henry. I've learned so much from you in such a short time." Henry nodded, and his face became more thoughtful. "That's what life's all about, isn't it? Learning and growing. It's something I try to instill in my boys every day." Charles leaned forward out of interest. "How do you do that? I mean, with all your success, it must be challenging to keep them grounded." Henry let out a soft laugh. "Yes, it's not always easy. But Cynthia and I think it's most important to teach them to be humble and kind." He stopped and drank some water before going on. "We could afford a much bigger house or fancier cars, but we choose to live simply. We want the boys to understand that true wealth isn't about material possessions." Charles paid close attention, interested in how Henry raised his kids. "Every weekend," Henry said with joy, "we help out at the local soup kitchen. The boys serve food, talk to people, and learn that everyone has a story that is worth hearing." "That's amazing," Charles said, truly amazed. "I bet it's had a real impact on them." Henry nodded, and a little mist came into his eyes. "It has. Just last week, Barry used his allowance to buy a warm coat for a homeless man he'd befriended at the kitchen. He didn't tell us about it. We found out from the shelter coordinator." Charles got a lump in his throat because the story made him feel so much. "You must be so proud." Henry said, "I am," his voice heavy with feeling. "But more than that, I'm grateful that we can provide for our family, while still teaching our boys the importance of giving back and treating everyone with respect." When the weather got warmer, Mr. Parker liked to sit on his front porch with an iced tea and watch the people walking by. His mind often went back to the Jameson family, and their story was always there. Mr. Parker heard a noise down the street one sunny afternoon. He had to close his eyes to see Mrs. Johnson, an old friend, struggling with her groceries. Before he could even think about helping, two little boys showed up and stood next to her. "Those are the Jameson boys," Mr. Parker said to himself, knowing Barry from what Charles had said. He paid close attention as the boys carefully took Mrs. Johnson's bags, their smiles sincere and bright. As they brought the groceries into her house, they talked happily with her. A small part of Mr. Parker was surprised by how nice they were. A few days later, Mr. Parker was driving through town and saw the younger Jameson boys, David and William, picking up trash in the park. While they worked hard, they laughed and raced to see who could fill their trash bag first. As Mr. Parker watched the scene, he slowed down his car. He couldn't help but notice how other kids joined in because the Jameson boys were an example. The park was soon clean again after being full of candy wrappers and beer cans. As the days went by, Mr. Parker became more aware of what the Jameson boys were doing in the neighborhood. He saw Barry helping a lost dog get back to its owner, Barry helping younger kids at the library, and all four boys helping out at different community events. Every little act of respect and kindness that Mr. Parker saw made him question his long-held biases. He began to doubt the things he believed in a lot more than a few weeks before. The boys' actions were very different from what he thought about their family. One night, Mr. Parker was sitting on his porch and watched the Jameson family walk along. The sound of their laughter carried on the warm breeze. He saw them stop and help a neighbor whose car had broken down. They all pushed the car to the side of the road. At that very moment, Mr. Parker felt very ashamed of himself. He understood that the only reason he had judged this family was because of the color of their skin, and not because of who they were as people. His biases, which were strong before, felt weak and unfair now. As Charles Parker got closer to his parents' house, he couldn't hold back his joy. He rang the doorbell with a big smile on his face. "Mom, Dad, I have great news," Charles yelled when Mr. Parker opened it. Mrs. Parker came out of the kitchen with a dish towel to wipe her hands. She was interested and asked, "What is it, dear?" Charles took a deep breath and said, "Next weekend, the company is having a big event. I'd love for you both to come. You can meet everyone and see where I work." Mr. Parker's face dropped right away, and he creased his brow in worry. "I don't know, son. You know how I feel about these social gatherings." Charles had a brief lapse in his smile, but he kept going. "Please, Dad, it would mean so much to me. You've always talked about wanting to understand my work better." Mr. Parker's wife put a soft hand on his arm. "I think it's a wonderful idea. We should support Charles, dear." He saw hope in the eyes of both his wife and his son when he looked at them. He let out a heavy sigh and slouched his shoulders in defeat. All right, we'll go." Charles was very happy. "Thanks, Dad. You won't regret it, I promise." As the event day got closer, Mr. Parker became more and more worried. He moved slowly around the house and talked about small talk in groups. Mrs. Parker watched him with a mix of worry and amusement. In the evening of the party, Mr. Parker stood in front of the mirror and adjusted his tie 10 times. His wife walked up behind him and pressed his jacket. She told him, "It'll be okay, dear. Charles is so excited to have us there." Mr. Parker tried to cool down by nodding. I know. I'm doing this for him." Charles was excited to talk about his coworkers and the company's recent successes as they drove to the event. Mr. Parker listened in silence while holding on tight to the driving wheel. As Charles led his parents into the venue, he looked around the room with his eyes. All of a sudden, he waved happily. "There's Henry and Cynthia. Come on, I want you to meet them." Mr. Parker stopped moving and his eyes grew big in recognition. Across the room stood the family he had once said they couldn't rent to. Charles led them to the Jamesons, but he didn't know the link, and his heart was racing. Charles led his parents across the room, and Mr. Parker could feel his heart beating fast. The crowd seemed to thin out, and Henry and Cynthia Jameson could be seen, standing next to a beautifully decorated table. When Mr. Parker gulped hard, his mouth went dry. All of a sudden, Charles was very proud and said, "Mom and Dad, I'd like you to meet Henry and Cynthia Jameson. They own the company I work for." With a friendly smile on his face, Henry put out his hand. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. and Mrs. Parker. Charles has told us so much about you." Mr. Parker thought about it for a second before he took Henry's hand. He was surprised by how hard and real the handshake was. "Likewise," he said, but his voice was so low it was almost a whisper. Cynthia took a step forward, and her eyes sparkled with kindness. "We're so glad you could make it tonight. Charles is such a wonderful addition to our team." Mr. Parker couldn't help but notice how other people in the room were looking at Henry and Cynthia as they said hello. There was an air of respect and admiration in the room. People who worked for the Jamesons felt free to talk to them and share jokes and stories. A young intern who looked stressed ran up to Henry. "Mr. Jameson, I'm so sorry to interrupt, but we have a small issue with the catering." Henry looked at the intern and spoke in a cool, clear voice. "Don't worry, Stella. Let's see what we can do to help." He kindly excused himself, which surprised Mr. Parker by how easy it was to talk to him. Cynthia started a chat with Mrs. Parker by asking her about their family and hobbies. Mr. Parker was amazed to see his wife calm down and laugh at Cynthia's gentle jokes. Throughout the evening, Mr. Parker saw the Jamesons talking to both guests and workers. They knew people's names, asked about their families, and seemed genuinely interested in everyone they talked to. There was no doubt that they deserved respect. But it was clear that it came from kindness and honesty, not from power. Everything Mr. Parker thought he knew about the Jamesons was put to the test as the night went on. Prejudices that seemed solid at first now seemed weak and based on nothing. He couldn't help but feel bad about what he had done in the past. Over the course of the evening, Mr. Parker became interested in talking to Henry Jameson. With a glass of sparkling water in each hand, they stood by a window that looked out over the city lights. Mr. Parker tried to keep his tone calm when he said, "Your business seems to be doing very well." Henry smiled and nodded. "We've been blessed, that's for sure. But success isn't just about money, you know." Mr. Parker looked interested and raised an eyebrow. "Oh, how do you mean?" Henry drank a little of his drink, and then went on. "Cynthia and I made a decision early on. We wanted our boys to understand the value of hard work and simplicity. But surely, with your success, you could afford a nicer way of life?" Mr. Parker asked, remembering the simple house he had seen. Henry's eyes lit up. "We could, but we choose not to. Our home might be small, but it's filled with love. We want our boys to know that true wealth comes from within." Mr. Parker felt bad about how quickly he had judged the Jamesons' rental application. He said in a soft voice, "That's great. You see," he said, "we believe in leading by example. Our boys see us working hard, giving back to the community. We want them to understand that success is about more than just accumulating wealth." As Henry talked, Mr. Parker thought about what was important to him again. He thought about how impressed his own son, Charles, had been with how the Jameson family worked together. Mr. Parker asked, "Don't you worry about your kids missing out?" He was expressing a worry he didn't even know he had. Henry shook his head, and his face looked calm. "Missing out on what? They have everything they need: love, education, and strong values. We're teaching them to be kind, to work hard, and to help others. In our eyes, that's the greatest wealth we can give them." There was silence as Mr. Parker thought about what Henry had said. He thought about himself, his big house, and his fancy cars. He thought for the first time that maybe he had been judging success wrong. Mr. Parker was thinking the next night as he sat in his study. Something deep inside him had been stirred by the talk with Henry Jameson. He heard a soft knock on the door as he looked out the window. "Come in," he said. Charles walked in with a worried look on his face. "Dad, is everything okay? You've been quiet since the event." The father of the boy sighed and motioned for him to sit down. "Charles, I've been doing some thinking about our values, about what really matters in life." Charles leaned in, interested. "What do you mean, Dad?" "I always thought that being successful meant having money, being well known, and keeping the right people around you," Mr. Parker said, his voice full of feeling. "But now, I'm not so sure." Charles gave his father a supportive nod when he could tell he was having a hard time. "Son, tell me more about the Jamesons," Mr. Parker asked, in a soft voice. What is it about them that impresses you so much? Charles's eyes got bright. Oh, Dad, they're amazing. Henry and Cynthia, they're so humble despite their success. And their boys, you should see how respectful and hardworking they are. Mr. Parker paid close attention as Charles went on. The Jamesons, they don't just talk about values. They live them. They teach their kids that true wealth comes from kindness and helping others. It's inspiring, really. At that moment, Mr. Parker felt a lump in his throat. And you admire that? I do, Dad, Charles honestly answered. It's made me think about what really matters in life. Integrity, humility, compassion, those are the things that make a person truly successful. Mr. Parker slowly nodded as his son's words hit him. You know, Charles, I think I've been wrong about a lot of things. I've judged people based on things that don't really matter. Charles put his hand on his dad's and patted it. It's never too late to change, Dad. The Jamesons have shown me that. They've taught me so much about what it means to be a good person. It made Mr. Parker proud to look into his son's eyes and see that they were full of knowledge and kindness. He saw that Charles had learned things that he was only now starting to get. Mr. Parker sat in his study for a long time after Charles had left, feeling a lot of different emotions. The weight of what he had done in the past pressed down on him. And for the first time in years, he felt real regret. He thought about the day he turned down the Jamesons' rental application. It seemed so easy and right at the time, but now that he thought about the weak reasons he had given, shame hit him like a cold wave. He asked the empty room, "What have I done?" Mr. Parker got up and went to the window, where he looked out at the well-kept grass of his private neighborhood. He used to be proud of how regular and perfect everything seemed. But now, all seemed empty and pointless. Henry Jameson had started a business from nothing and taught his kids the value of hard work and humility. He also thought of Cynthia Jameson, whose warmth and kindness had touched Charles's heart. After a moment of pain, Mr. Parker understood that he had been denying his community the richness of their presence. I judged them without knowing them, he said out loud, his voice heavy with anger. My bias kept me from seeing who they really were. The guilt was eating away at him, getting stronger every second. He thought about how the Jamesons had built a simple house on the edge of town, because he wouldn't let himself see anything else. If only he had given them a chance, things might have turned out differently. Mr. Parker put his face in his hands and leaned back in his chair. He had always been proud of being a great businessman and a strong member of the community. But now, he realized that those things didn't mean much. What good was money if it meant giving up your humanity? He whispered, I've been so wrong, as tears welled up in his eyes. What a terrible thing. Mr. Parker felt a deep sense of loss as the truth of what he had done hit him. He missed out on getting to know a wonderful family that would have made his town better by being there. Even worse, he had missed the chance to learn and grow by not letting himself see past his biases. The guilt was too much to bear, but there was also a spark of another desire, to fix things and be better. Even though Mr. Parker knew he still had a long way to go, he felt hopeful for the first time in years. It might not have been too late to change and learn from his mistakes. Henry and Charles were having a quiet moment together while drinking hot coffee in the break room. Even though the office was busy, Henry leaned in and spoke in a low, honest voice. You know, Charles, Henry began, his eyes wide with memory. It wasn't easy to build our house. We almost gave up a few times. Charles paid close attention and forgot about his coffee as he took in every word. Henry went on, we were so sad when your dad turned down our rental application. Cynthia, bless her heart, told Henry, we'll build our own house. The important thing is that it will be full of love. When his father was brought up, Charles felt bad, but he kept quiet because he was eager to hear more. While wearing a small smile, Henry said, we found that plot on the edge of town. We had it, even though it wasn't much. I would clear the land every day after work. The boys would come with me when they could. Little William would try to take sticks that were too big for him. Henry's eyes were wet with tears that hadn't dried yet. Some nights, my hands were so blistered that I could hardly hold a fork. Cynthia would fix me up, and we'd all pray and thank God for what we had. Charles got a lump in his throat as he thought about how the Jameson family was working together to get through this tough time, handling each problem with grace and drive. The worst part was when the first winter storm came, Henry said, his voice barely above a whisper. The roof wasn't finished yet. It was so cold that I'll never forget being under a blanket with Cynthia and the boys while it rained. The picture hurt Charles's heart. He put a nice hand on Henry's shoulder to make him feel better. But what do you know? My voice is getting stronger, Henry said. We never thought about giving up. Every problem we faced only made us stronger. When we finally moved in, it wasn't just a house. It was a home that we had built together with love and hope. Charles was amazed at how strong the Jameson family was. He was deeply moved by their steadfast faith in the face of hardship. He understood that real strength wasn't about money or fame, but about dealing with life's problems with honor and determination. Charles stood uncomfortably in the kitchen of the Parker family home, moving the silverware around on the table. He caught a glimpse of his father, Mr. Parker, who was moving quickly back and forth in the living room. Charles said softly, "Dad, calm down. They're just regular people." After pacing, Mr. Parker stopped and looked at his son. He looked at him with eyes that were both worried and determined. "Yes, son, I just want to fix things." When the doorbell rang, both men jumped a little. Charles took a deep breath and went to the door to answer it. When he opened it, the Jameson family was there to meet him with smiles. "Welcome," Charles said, with real happiness in his voice. "Please come in." The Jamesons' four sons, Barry, David, and William, came in after Henry and Cynthia Jameson. Each of them had a dish with them, which filled the room with the smell of delicious food. Mr. Parker took a step forward, and his hands were shaking a little. He spoke with a heavy heart. "Mr. and Mrs. Jameson, I'm so glad you could join us tonight." Henry put out his hand, and his eyes were kind and understanding. "Thanks for having us, Mr. Parker. It's an honor to be here." Mr. Parker felt ashamed as they shook hands. He thought of his past biases and how they had hurt this family, but Henry's eyes didn't show any anger. They showed only love. Cynthia stepped forward and gave Mr. Parker an apple pie she had made herself. With a soft smile, she said, "We hope you enjoy the dessert." Mr. Parker took the pie, and his eyes started to tear up. "Thank you very much." "Thanks." As they made their way to the dining room, the Jameson boys' chatter and laughing filled the Parker home. The baby, William, pulled on Mr. Parker's sleeve. He asked, "Parker, did you know that my dad built our whole house?" His eyes were wide with wonder. Mr. Parker got down on his knees next to William. He felt bad because he knew what his actions had caused this family to go through. "Is that true?" I said it softly. "Your dad must be very smart and work hard." William happily agreed. "He is. Mommy says our house is unique because it was built with love." At that moment, Mr. Parker felt a lump in his throat. Henry and Cynthia were watching with soft smiles on their faces as he looked up at them. But at that moment, he saw how strong the family really was, even though he had been so hard on them before. Mr. Parker cleared his throat as everyone sat down at the table. "Before we start," he said, his voice a little shaking, "I'd like to say something." As the dinner went on, there was easy talk at the table. As Charles and Cynthia talked about their jobs at the fancy car company, the Jameson boys told stories about their school, and Henry Jameson and Mr. Parker, on the other hand, got into a deep talk. "You know, Mr. Jameson," Mr. Parker said, in a soft, serious voice, "I have to say I'm impressed by the values you've taught your family." Henry gave a warm smile. "Say thanks to Mr. Parker. Cynthia and I both think that having strong morals is important for living a good life." Mr. Parker nodded, and a new sense of respect came over his eyes. I see that. The boys in your family are so polite and driven. What do you do to handle it? Henry drank a little water before he spoke. He said, "It's not always easy, but we believe in leading by example. We teach our boys how important it is to work hard, be kind, and be humble." Mr. Parker leaned in and seemed to be paying close attention to everything Henry said. When he thought about his own life and the choices he had made, he felt bad about them. "What about your choice to live a simple life?" Mr. Parker asked, genuinely interested. "I mean, you run a successful business, but choose to live a simple life. Why does that happen?" Henry looked at his wife and sons with sparkling eyes. "We want our boys to know that real wealth isn't defined by money or things. It's about family, neighborhood, and making the world a better place." Mr. Parker knew that something was changing inside him. When he looked around the table at the happy, talking people, he saw more than just a family. He saw a community, one that he had once tried to keep out. "Community," Mr. Parker said again, in a soft voice. "I can see how important that is getting." Henry nodded. He looked serious but friendly. "Mr. Parker, a strong group makes everyone better. We all gain when we help each other, no matter how different we are." The more they talked, the more respect Mr. Parker had for Henry Jameson. He saw a man in front of him who was honest, smart, and kind. And those traits had nothing to do with his skin color. As the dinner ended, there was silence around the table. Mr. Parker cleared his throat, and tears filled his eyes. He looked at Henry and Cynthia Jameson with a sad heart because of what he had done in the past. Mr. and Mrs. Jameson," he began, his voice trembling a little, "I'm sorry to both of you." The Jamesons looked at each other with shock, and Charles watched with interest. After taking a big breath, Mr. Parker went on. "I turned down your rental application for all the wrong reasons. When you asked to rent one of my properties." Cynthia put her hand on Henry's arm to comfort him without saying a word. Mr. Parker said, "I was biased," and his voice was barely above a whisper. "I judged you based on the color of your skin, not on what you were like as a person. And I was so wrong." As Mr. Parker talked, tears started to form in his eyes. "Getting to know you and your family has helped me see things in a new way. You've shown me what honesty, kindness, and family values really look like. I feel very bad about what I did, and I hope you can forgive me." For a moment, there was silence in the room. Henry and Cynthia just looked at each other and talked without saying a word. Henry then smiled softly at Mr. Parker. "Mr. Parker," he said, in a warm, earnest voice, "thank you for being honest. We need to be brave to admit when we're wrong." Cynthia agreed and nodded. "We've all done things we're not proud of," she said in a soft voice. "What counts is how we use them to learn and grow." Mr. Parker looked at them in shock, shocked by how kind they were. "Are you really ready to forgive me now?" Henry put his hand on Mr. Parker's shoulder from across the table. "We can choose to forgive, Mr. Parker, and we're happy to do so. Your sorry means a lot to us." Mr. Parker's face was filled with tears of happiness and thanks. He felt like a huge weight had been taken off his shoulders. He knew right then that his life would never be the same again. The next morning, Mr. Parker felt like he had a new purpose in life. It felt good to be free of his guilt, but he had a strong need to do more. To make things right with the Jameson family, he wanted to do something real. He gave it a lot of thought before deciding to rent them the house they had first applied for. It was a lovely house that was a lot bigger and cozier than where they were living now. Mr. Parker thought that this action would show that he really did say sorry and wanted to make things right. When Mr. Parker picked up the phone and called Henry Jameson's number, he was both worried and determined. Mr. Parker took a deep breath and told Henry about his offer. When he answered, "Mr. Jameson," he said, with sincerity in his voice, "I'd like to offer you and your family the rental property you first applied for. It's still open, and I'd appreciate it if you'd think about it." The other end of the line took a short break. Henry then spoke. His voice was soft, but strong. "Mr. Parker, thank you so much for your offer. Thank you very much. But Cynthia and I have to say no." Mr. Parker felt like he was let down. "May I ask why?" he asked in a soft voice. Henry let out a soft laugh. "Let me show you something. The house we built is more than just a house to us. It shows how much our family values and works together. We put everything we had into it, and it's where we have so many wonderful moments with our boys." Henry had put the call on speakerphone, and Cynthia's voice came in. "Our house is simple, but it's full of love and laughter," she said. "We want to be there more than anywhere else." Mr. Parker listened with a lump in his throat. He was touched by how happy the Jamesons were and how well they knew what was important in life. He said, "I understand," and his voice was full of feeling. "Your house sounds great. Thanks for letting me know." When the talk was over, Mr. Parker had a lot of respect for what the Jameson family had decided. They could have bought a bigger house, but they chose to stay in their small one instead. This says a lot about their character and values. After meeting the Jameson family, Mr. Parker went through a big change in the weeks that followed. His longtime business friends noticed that he had become more humble and wanted to be more open and welcoming in how he ran his business. An early morning board meeting was going on when Mr. Parker got to his office, which was a surprise. When he walked into the room, everyone stopped talking and looked at him. The air was tense and full of a charge that wasn't said. The senior partner of Parker spoke first. "Parker," he said, "we need to talk about the direction of this company." Mr. Parker sat down, his heart beating fast. He paid attention as his partners talked about their worries. They talked about property values going down, less privacy, and a bad image. He felt like every word was a blow to the chest. Mr. Jameson told her straight out, "Your new way of doing things is costing us money. Your sentimentality is too much for us to handle." Even though Mr. Parker tried to support his point of view by talking about how important diversity and acceptance are, no one listened. They saw his change of heart as a sign of weakness and a threat to their business. After a fierce argument, it was clear that Mr. Parker would be leaving the company he had built from the ground up. The truth hit him like a ton of bricks. As he tried to understand how big what was going on was, he felt the room spin. Mr. Parker thought about the money issues as he shook his hands and packed up his office. A lot of his money was stuck in the business. He was now going to lose a lot of money. Things were getting worse in the life he had known. It wasn't just the money, though. As word got out that he had been fired, many of Mr. Parker's friends stopped hanging out with him. People he had known for years stopped calling him and stopped inviting him to events. The loss of a loved one hurt even more than the loss of money. Mr. Parker was at a loss as he tried to deal with the quick changes in his life. The once proud landlord now had to deal with fear and doubt every day. His safe world had fallen apart, leaving him feeling lost and alone. On a very cloudy afternoon, Mr. Parker was sitting in his now quiet home when the phone rang. He almost didn't answer because he didn't want to get another rejection or sympathy call, but something made him do it. "Hello?" He spoke in a voice that was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Hi, Parker, this is Henry Jameson. I found out what took place. Are you okay?" Mr. Parker was shocked by the worry in Henry's words. There was a lump in his throat, and he couldn't speak for a moment. He finally got the words out, "I'm not sure." The line picked up Henry's warm voice again. "Cynthia and I are having dinner tonight and would like you to join us. There's no need to rush, but we thought you might enjoy some company." Mr. Parker thought about it for a moment, then surprised himself by saying, "Yes." That night, he found himself sitting at the Jamesons' simple but warm dinner table, surrounded by the love and kindness of a family that had been hurt by his prejudice in the past. The air was filled with the smell of home-cooked food, and the Jameson boys' talk made for soothing background noise while they ate. Henry and Cynthia urged Mr. Parker in a gentle way to talk about his problems. Their real care and kindness touched him deeply. Cynthia said in a soft voice, "You know, Mr. Parker, life throws us curveballs to teach us important lessons. This is just a small problem. You'll make it through this." Henry agreed and nodded. "You're not the only one. We're here to help in any way we can." He could feel tears coming to his eyes. The love and support from the family he had turned down before were too much for him to handle. After his world had been turned upside down, he felt hope for the first time in a long time. He whispered, "Thank you," and his voice was full of, "Thank you for being kind to me. I don't deserve it." They told him that everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and given a second chance. They told him to keep a good attitude and offered to help him in any way they could. In the weeks that followed, Mr. Parker was in a tough spot. He felt lost after losing his business and all of his money. But the Jameson family's kindness gave him hope. He knew he needed to find a new goal, something that would help him make up for his mistakes and do good things for his community. Another day, Mr. Parker was reading the local newspaper when he saw an ad for a job at the community center. They were looking for someone to help them organize outreach and volunteer projects. He made up his mind right away to apply. Mr. Parker was shocked and thrilled when he was offered the job. As he walked into the busy community center on his first day, he felt excited in a way he hadn't felt in years. It was a far cry from his old job as a rich landlord. It was a simple job that paid well. Mr. Parker found himself in charge of food drives, after-school programs for kids from low-income families, and job fairs for people who needed them. Every day brought new problems to solve and chances to make people's lives better. With the help of people from all walks of life, Mr. Parker changed the way he saw the world. He heard tales of struggle and victory, of hardship and hope. The different kinds of people in the community he used to avoid became a source of strength and motivation for him. Putting together diversity and equality classes and seminars was one of his favorite things to do. Mr. Parker worked hard to plan and study these events because he wanted to help other people not make the same mistakes he did. He told his own story of change in the hopes that it would make other people think about their own prejudices and biases. And as the weeks turned into months, Mr. Parker felt truly happy in his new job. He loved seeing the joy on a child's face when they got a warm meal, the gratitude in a job seeker's eyes when they found work, and the friendship between volunteers working toward a shared goal. He often thought about the talk he had with the Jamesons, and realized that this moment of trouble had, in fact, taught him very important lessons. It was easier for him now, but his life was still full of meaning and purpose. The Jameson boys started going to the community center every week as the seasons changed. While they were still in school, Barry, David, and William would often stop by to help out and learn from Mr. Parker. When the boys walked through the door, Mr. Parker's face would light up. Their excitement and energy spread, giving the center's programs a new lease on life. The job fairs were especially interesting to Barry, who was the oldest. Besides helping Mr. Parker set up booths, he would also greet people looking for work, and his natural charm would make them feel at ease. Barry, who is very good at art, volunteered to make colorful posters for future events. These posters made the walls of the center look better. David was always very active, and during food drives, he was very busy. He would move like lightning as he sorted donations and packed boxes. William, the youngest, got along well with the younger kids who came to the after-school events. He would wait calmly and read them stories or help them with their homework. Mr. Parker was amazed at how each boy brought something special to the center. He saw in them the principles their parents had taught them. They were kind, humble, and really wanted to help other people. One afternoon, after a very busy day, Mr. Parker stopped to watch the boys while they cleaned up, while David and William swept the floor and made it a game to see who could gather the most dust. Barry showed Barry how to properly fold the tables. With a heavy heart, Mr. Parker said, "You boys are a true blessing. "We'd be lost without you here," she said. The boys were so proud of him that they smiled at him. "We're happy to help, Mr. Parker," Barry said. "It's satisfying to alter things." Mr. Parker nodded, but he could feel a lump in his throat. He felt bad about hurting their family when he turned down their rental application. He remembered the day. These boys, whom he had once tried to avoid, were now giving his life so much joy and meaning. As the days turned into weeks, Mr. Parker got used to going to the community center every day. His new, simple life was very different from the one he had as a rich owner. But it was rich in a way he had never known before. He got up early every day, made coffee, and walked to the center. He would smile at the friendly people he saw on the street and answer with a warm greeting. It was very different from the cold nods he used to give when he was only thinking about his business company. Being at the center, Mr. Parker took part in all of the daily events. He helped set up groups for adults to learn how to read and write, worked with people looking for jobs, and even started a small vegetable garden in the back lot. It was hard work that sometimes made him tired, but it gave him a feeling of purpose that he had never felt before. One day, while he was taking care of the tomato plants, Mrs. Johnson, an older woman who often came to the center, came up to him. "Mr. Parker," she said, with a smile, "I never thought the day would come when you'd have dirt under your nails." Mr. Parker laughed and looked down at his dirty hands. "Mrs. Johnson, neither did I, but I have to say I really enjoy it." They talked for a while about the garden and the dinner that was going to happen soon. It hit Mr. Parker how much he appreciated these simple interactions. As Mrs. Johnson left, he had kept people at a distance in a past life, because he saw relationships as nothing more than business deals. Now, these real TIs made him happy. The potluck in the neighborhood was a great example of this new happiness. Mr. Parker showed up with a dish of roasted garden veggies from the center. As soon as he walked into the busy community hall, everyone smiled and said hello. The laughter of children filled the air as they ran around, and adults talked animatedly in small groups. People would talk to Mr. Parker about a wide range of topics, from their favorite local sports teams to the best apple pie recipes. That night, he laughed more than he had in years, and he felt a longing that he had never felt in his past life of wealth and power. Mr. Parker saw his own image in a window as he helped clean up after the party. The man who was looking back at him seemed less tense, happier, and younger than the man he used to be. He understood that even though he had lost his money, he had gained something much more valuable: a community, real friends, and a sense of purpose. Charles Parker couldn't help but notice how much his father had changed over the course of the weeks. Mr. Parker had changed from a man who was strict and hard to get along with to one who was kind and caring. Charles was proud of his dad every time he saw him with the other people in the neighborhood. At the center, Charles planned a surprise trip to the community center for his dad one sunny afternoon. As he got closer, he saw Mr. Parker on his knees in the garden, carefully teaching a group of kids how to plant seedlings. Charles felt a lump in his throat when he saw it. "Dad!" Charles yelled and waved as he walked over. When Mr. Parker looked up, a big smile broke out on his face. "Charles, what a nice surprise." He got up and brushed the dirt off his knees. Charles gave his dad a hug, and he didn't care that the dirt got on his clothes. He said in a friendly voice, "I stopped by to see how you're doing." Mr. Parker was very proud as he showed Charles around the center, introducing him to the regulars and telling him about the different programs they had going on. Charles listened carefully, and his heart swelled with pride at how hardworking his dad was. Charles turned to his dad as they sat on a bench outside in the late afternoon sun. He told his dad, "Dad, I just want you to know how proud I am of you." His voice was moving. "It's inspiring how you've jumped into this new part of your life." Mr. Parker's eyes were wet with tears that hadn't dried yet. He put his hand on Charles's and squeezed it. "Thank you, kid. I appreciate your help a lot." They both thought about how far they had come while sitting in peace for a moment. Their friendship had grown stronger and more beautiful over time. At first, Mr. Parker's strict beliefs made it hard for Charles to connect with him. "You know," Mr. Parker said in a soft voice, "I used to think that success was measured by. It used to be about money and power, but now I know that real success comes from the TIs we make and the lives we change." Charles answered with a nod. He felt very close to his dad. "Yes, Dad, I agree completely. You're making a difference in so many lives here." As they talked, shared stories, and laughed together, both the father and son were thankful for their increased closeness. Neither of them had changed, but their friendship had. They both looked forward to the journey ahead with each other. As the weeks turned into months, people in the neighborhood began to notice how much Mr. Parker had changed. The owner, who used to be distant and strict, was now a regular at the community center. His desire to promote equality and help others showed in everything he did. People who used to talk behind Mr. Parker's back about his biases now spoke highly of him. They saw how hard he worked to put together events that brought people from all walks of life together, and how he treated everyone with respect and kindness. An old woman named Mrs. Johnson had lived in the area for many years and told a friend, "You know, I never thought I'd see the day when old Mr. Parker would be the heart of this community. Now look at him." In fact, Mr. Parker was often seen talking with people from all walks of life, listening to their stories and helping them out when he could. He set up mentorship programs for at-risk teens and adults, food drives for people in need, and even a community farm where everyone could grow fresh food together. The Jameson boys Barry, David, and William showed up to help out at the center every week. Because of Mr. Parker's dedication, they would often bring their friends, sending a message of acceptance and togetherness to everyone in their school. In one day, Mr. Parker heard two teens talking while he was working to set up for a multicultural festival at the center. Someone said, "Man, Mr. Parker is so cool. Do you remember how scared everyone was of him?" "Yeah," said the other person. "Now, he's like the grandfather everyone wants." When these words were said, Mr. Parker felt a warmth go through his chest. He understood that his journey of personal growth had changed more than just him. It was also affecting everyone in the community. When the festival started, Mr. Parker stayed back and watched as people from all walks of life talked about their countries, laughed, and got to know each other. He felt very good about himself because he knew he had helped bring this different group of people together. Mr. Parker stood in the busy community center and looked at the bright decorations on the walls. His eyes were sparkling with joy. Banners that said, "Celebrating our diversity," hung from the ceiling. And around the room, tables were filled with food from different countries. He worked hard for weeks to make sure that this event would be a celebration of togetherness that everyone in the town would never forget. As more and more people came in, Mr. Parker smiled and shook each person's hand. He was happy to see people from all walks of life getting together and laughing and telling stories. The air was filled with the delicious smells of foods from all over the world, and the soothing sounds of different kinds of music. He got very excited when the Jameson family showed up. He ran over to them quickly and put out his arms to meet them. He spoke with a heavy heart. "Henry, Cynthia, thank you so much for coming. Tonight, we're having you as our guests of honor." Henry tightened his grip on Mr. Parker's hand. "John, we wouldn't have missed it for the world," he said, using Mr. Parker's first name like a close friend. Then Cynthia said, with a smile, "This is great. There are a lot of people here." It was true that the community center was full. People of all ages and walks of life talked excitedly, with happy and interested looks on their faces. The Jameson boys Barry, David, and William spread out quickly into the crowd, ready to hang out with their friends and help with the fun. As the night went on, Mr. Parker went on the small stage that was set up at one end of the room. When he tapped the mic, everyone in the room went quiet. He started, friends and neighbors, I want to thank you all for coming tonight." His voice was clear and loud. "There's more to this event than just tasty food and cool music. Celebrating the many layers of our community is what it's all about." He took a moment to look around the room before focusing on the Jamesons. "I want to thank the Jameson family even more. Their forgiveness and kindness taught me what it means to be part of a group and be accepted. They taught me that our differences are not something to be afraid of, but something to be proud of." A round of applause broke out, and Mr. Parker's heart grew full of thanks. A sea of handshakes, hugs, and words of thanks surrounded him as he walked off the stage. It wasn't just a success. The event changed everything for the whole neighborhood. As the neighborhood event came to an end, Mr. Parker sat down with the Jameson family at a table. The center was less busy, with only a few people moving around to clean up. There was still a nice feeling in the air from how well the evening went. Henry Jameson held up his lemonade glass. He smiled and said, "To new beginnings and true friendship." Everyone at the table smiled widely and clinked their glasses together. There was a lump in Mr. Parker's throat as he looked around at the faces of the people he had grown to love. Cynthia leaned in close to Mr. Parker and looked at him with kind eyes. "John, we're so grateful that you planned this event. I've never seen the community come together like this before." He shook his head in a humble way. "I ought to thank you," he said, his voice heavy with feeling. "Your family taught me what's important in life. You taught me how important it is to be kind and humble." One of the Jameson boys, Barry, spoke up. "Mr. Parker, do you remember when we first started helping out at the community center? You were so scared about everything." Mr. Parker laughed along with everyone else. He said, "Oh, I was a mess. But you guys were so nice to me. This old dog now knows new tricks, thanks to you." Barry, who was the second to oldest, smiled. "Now look at you. You're like the center of the community." As they talked and laughed, telling stories and jokes, Mr. Parker felt deeply satisfied. He was amazed at how much his life had changed when he saw the Jamesons. Henry had a wise smile, Cynthia had soft eyes, and the boys were full of energy. He was having a simple meal with people he used to avoid. And he felt richer than he ever did when he was rich. The laughs around the table were worth more to him than anything he had ever owned. The happiness in his heart was worth more than all of his business wins put together. Can living a simple life make you happier than having a lot of money and nice things? Do you say yes or no? Write your answer in the box below. I'd love to hear your point of view. Also, please follow my channel if you liked the video. Thank you so much for your support. I spend hours and hours writing these touching stories for you.